Let's look at the list of the companies in the world that spend the most on research and development. This is in 2022, but I don't think it's changed very much since then. Number one in the world is Amazon, $73 billion in a year. Alphabet, Google, 39 billion, Facebook, 35 billion, Apple, 27 billion, Microsoft. So the top five are all in the US, and they're all technology companies, and they're all companies that were startups. Sometimes in the case of Google within the last 20 or 30 years, sometimes more like 40 or 50 years, like Apple and Microsoft. But these are all companies that started off in the last 50 years as very small, have grown very rapidly, and are now spending tens of billions on research and development. The first non-US one is Huawei in China with $24 billion per year, then Volkswagen in Germany, Samsung in South Korea, then back to Intel, and finally Roche, which is a drug company. No Australian company spends over $1 billion on R&D. The most recent figures I could see, the highest spender was Telstra at about $500 million. I think it's actually dropped off since then. So in some way this is the big difference between Australia and overseas countries. We don't spend much on industrial research and development because we don't have these big technological companies. And most of these big technological companies were tiny startup companies, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and they've now grown to enormous size. So perhaps the real question is, why doesn't Australia have successful technology startups? I mean, we do have some at Atlassian and some of our medical research companies, but nothing like as many as have been produced by Silicon Valley. One way to think of it is we always regard ANU as being one of the world's great research universities. If that's true, why isn't it surrounded by startup companies, just like Stanford University in the US is surrounded by startups, or MIT? I mean, there are startup companies around ANU, and maybe we should be comparing ourselves more like places like Oxford or Harvard, which don't have anything like as many startup companies. But nonetheless, part of the reason why our research and development is so low now is because 30, 40, 50 years ago, they didn't have people starting technology companies that became very, very large by now and could now be spending tens of billions on research and development. So why is the case? I've read a lot of books about this. Australia clearly has a lot of very smart scientists and industrialists, many of whom have actually gone overseas and set up companies in Silicon Valley. Technological breakthroughs like, for example, Wi-Fi, which was invented by scientists at CSIRO Radio Astronomy, were exploited overseas. So one idea, and no one knows the answer to this, this is just some ideas that have been thrown up, it's probably a combination of all of these things. One idea is basically we have a very small market. As a startup company, you need to find someone you can sell these things to, and if you're in the US with 300 million people, it's going to be a lot easier to find an initial market. Or maybe it's not a general initial market. A lot of startups started off by selling things at high prices to the US defense contractors. So maybe the fact that we don't spend so much on defense or NASA or something like this means there isn't that money when a company is very young, when it's making products that are still very expensive to help expand things. Another idea is we do the wrong sorts of science. We do too much pure science, like my own field of astrophysics. This is very good in terms of research impact, publications and citations, but maybe we need more people working on how to manufacture cheap semiconductors and less people trying to study the Big Bang and the origin of the universe. There's always been this idea that you get linear model of science. You get pure science, which then produces applied science, which then produces industrial stuff. But that doesn't often work. A lot of pure science never has any spin-offs, and often it works the other way around. Some industrial science produces a new piece of equipment that allows pure science to work. So maybe it's a problem. Too much pure science, not enough applied science. Then there's the issue of a lack of venture capital funding. Let's say you've got an idea, you want to build a new piece of software or a new piece of technology, you're going to need money. It's going to take you a long time to develop the technology enough to manufacture them before you can start selling them, so you need someone to lend you money while you get through that so-called valley of death, while you do the research and development and while you build your factory and then start selling these things. And traditionally, banks are the main place you get money in Australia, and banks would be very happy to lend you money to buy a house, but they're much less happy to risk money on a speculative venture that may or may not pay off. This is allied to the fourth point. Maybe we have a risk-averse culture. In the early days, Australians were very happy to travel halfway around the world in search of a gold rush and to gamble like crazy. We certainly love our risk when it comes to gambling. Australians lose more money gambling per capita than any other country on earth. But when it comes to investing money and trying startups, people seem to be not so happy. Now, part of this is because I think many people in Australia do not understand the risk proposition of a technology startup. So here we've got, let's say you invest some money, or which might be investing your own time or your own money in a startup. Let's say I quit my job at ANU to start up a company to develop, I don't know, artificial intelligence-based learning agents. I'll need money from somewhere, and then you've got to ask, how much will you get back? Now, let's say I was setting up a restaurant or a new shop or something fairly traditional where there have been lots of other ones produced in the world. The bank might invest the money and it might expect to get its money back, and if it's lucky it might get more than its money back, or there might be some profit, and if it goes badly it might get less. So there'd be something like a bell curve, like the red line here, hopefully shifted a bit above one, where you can be reasonably sure you'll get most of your money back. For example, if the bank loans money for you to buy a house, they've got the mortgage in the house, so they're only going to lose money if house prices crash, and they usually insist that you've put in more equity in the house to minimize the risk of that, and they'll get more money back. So this is a typical sort of investment that most banks in Australia are used to making, and the idea is always minimize your risk. Make sure this person is going to be able to pay you back, that you're not going to lose your money. And so that's very much the culture in Australian banks. It's also the culture for many Australian people. Like, I have a good university job. If I give that up, I could end up with no money at all. Is it worth taking the risk? Because there is a real risk. These technology companies, most of them fail. This blue line shows the return on investment for a technology company, and you can see in most of the cases the company fails. It's a power law distribution. So probably 60, 70, 80% of the time you're going to lose some or all of your money. And there's a relatively small probability of making a profit. But that profit could, for a very small fraction of people, be absolutely staggering. So if you were an early investor in your Microsoft or Tesla or something like this, you could be worth tens of billions of dollars now. So in the US, venture capital has got this blue curve internalized. They know that they're going to lose money on most of their investments. But they're not worried about that, because the most you can lose is what you put in. But you could gain 10, 100, 1,000 times what you put in. So for venture capital funding, the problem is not the risk of losing your money. The real risk is losing something that's going to become very, very big. One of those rare companies that becomes enormous. So it's a quite different psychology, quite different from the banks. Which banks always, are we sure we're going to get our money back? Governments tend to be like that as well. If we're going to invest money in science, we've got to be sure that we're going to get some good product out of it. Whereas venture capital is a quite different thing. Most of the time you're going to fail, and you know this. But a small fraction of the time you'll make so much money, it'll pay back the other 10, 20, 30 things that lose money. This is actually a lot more common than you might think. It's, for example, how the publishing industry works. Most books lose money for a publisher, but a small number make huge amounts of money. So you've got to invest in lots of authors to find those rare ones. You try your best to work out which ones are going to go gangbusters. It's also the same for movies. Most movies don't make much money, but a small number make huge amounts, and that's why you have movie studios that invest in a wide variety of movies, so the blockbusters, the ones that make billions of dollars, can pay off all the ones that flop. But it's a different culture, and this is arguably the United States' big advantage. They have this culture of risk everything. Of course, they're not really risking everything. If there's a huge number of startups around and yours goes bankrupt, in the US, that's often a badge of honor. Yes, I've gone through 3 companies, they all went bankrupt. It's not a disadvantage, but in Australia, do you think a bank's going to give you money? You've had 3 companies and they've all gone bankrupt. Why should we loan any money to you? You're going to lose our money. Whereas in the US, venture capital people may say, well, you've probably learned a lot from this. You've learned what can go wrong, and maybe you've got a better than average chance of being one of those rare companies that's going to do incredibly well. So which of these is true? We don't know. Probably a mix of all of these things. And A lot of people are working very hard to try and make Australia a better place to develop startup companies, and hopefully the startup companies that are being founded now in the next few years will be the giant technology companies 20, 30, 40 years in the future.